Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking on, well, a truly vast and fascinating subject, the evolution of psychology itself.
It's a big one.
Right. This field, it seeks to understand everything about the human condition, from, the mechanics of how your brain perceives the color red.
All the way to the complex reasoning behind the most crucial life choices you make every day.
And our sources for this deep dive trace the journey of psychology from when it was strictly a philosophical pursuit in the 19th century, right up to the data-driven, criteria-based science we rely on today.
And if you look closely at the history, you see two massive turning points. The first was how biology, specifically Darwinian theory, provided the empirical scaffolding.
The framework.
The framework, exactly. The scaffolding necessary for the field to shift from studying the vague concept of the mind to focusing only on measurable behavior. And that was the birth of behaviorism.
Okay, and the second major transformation.
That came later, deep inside clinical psychology, as practitioners really struggled to standardize diagnosis. And this led to a massive internal reckoning about validity, bias, and classification, culminating in the, controversial but powerful DSM era, and crucially, the essential challenges raised by early pioneers who fought against the institutional biases in the field.
So our mission today is to give you the ultimate cheat sheet on the pivotal ideas, the surprising facts, and the key individuals who transform the study of the psyche into the science of behavior.
And this will help you understand not just what psychology is today, but why it's structured the way it is.
Okay, let's unpack this.
To find the conceptual foundations of scientific psychology, we have to start in 19th century England, and specifically with Charles Darwin.
Before Darwin, it was hard to even argue that the human mind was purely a subject for natural science.
That's because Darwin's theory of natural selection, summarized by the concepts of variability, competition, and heritability, did something revolutionary.
It wasn't just about finch beaks.
No, not at all. It wasn't just about bodies. It suggested that our nervous systems and our behaviors were also molded by evolution, sharing a common origin with our primate ancestors.
And once you establish that human behavior belongs to the natural world, well, it's fair game for scientific study, for measurement.
Exactly.
But measuring something as complex as human behavior requires tools. And for that, we turn to Darwin's own polymath cousin, Francis Galton.
Galton's initial reaction to reading on the origin of species was reportedly profound, almost a philosophical conversion for him.
He saw it.
He decided that if evolution was the mechanism of nature, then applying those principles to human intelligence and behavior was the best way to, improve humankind.
And his sheer ingenuity in creating measurement tools it's astounding. He coined the phrase that defines the field, nature and nurture.
Yes, to describe that dual influence of biological inheritance versus environmental upbringing.
Right.
And to try and tease those factors apart, he pioneered the use of twin studies, which are, still a staple of behavioral genetics today.
But how did he even manage all the data he was collecting? He was trying to measure human characteristics across huge populations. Did he just have to invent the tools to manage the scale of it all?
Essentially, yes. Galton is responsible for introducing fundamental statistical tools into science. Things like the normal distribution, scatter plots, correlation, regression.
All of them.
He built these tools because he needed a quantitative way to handle the mounds of data coming out of his anthropometric laboratory. He needed to find relationships between variables, and those tools allowed him to do it.
So while Galton was focused on measuring individual differences in England, at the same time, a revolution was happening in Germany.
A totally different one.
Focused on measuring the general mechanisms of the mind through the lens of physics. And here's where it gets really interesting.
This is the era of psychophysics, which is basically the study of the relationship between physical stimuli and our resulting sensations.
And the central figure here is Gustav Fechner, who is just a fascinating character. He was initially a satirical writer under the pen name Dr. Mises.
He was, and he had this dramatic, life-changing episode, right?
Yeah, tell us about that.
He suffered a mysterious malady that involved him almost destroying his vision looking at the sun while researching after images.
Oh, wow.
He retreated to a dark room for 3 years. When he emerged, his focus shifted entirely to the mind-body problem. He adopted this idea called panpsychism.
Which is the idea that the physical and mental worlds are two aspects of the same reality.
Exactly. And he decided the mind could be measured, just indirectly.
And he did this by building on the work of Ernst Weber, who discovered the just noticeable difference, or J&D.
The JND, right. So
Yeah.
the JND is the smallest difference between two stimuli that a person can reliably detect.
So it's not an absolute value.
No, Weber found it's always a proportion of the original stimulus. If you're holding 1 pound, you'll need to add a certain percentage to notice the change. If you're holding 10 pounds, you need that same percentage, but a much larger absolute change. That's Weber's law.
And Fechner took that proportional relationship and derived a logarithmic function that mathematically relates the intensity of a stimulus to the intensity of the perceived sensation. That's the famous Weber-Fechner law.
And that's the core of outer psychophysics measuring stimulus to sensation. But Fechner also theorized inner psychophysics, correlating brain activity and mental states.
Which was dismissed at the time.
Oh, completely. It was seen as eccentric fantasy in the 19th century, but it is precisely what modern neuroimaging aims to achieve today. It just shows how far ahead of his time he was.
Speaking of polymaths who redefined measurement, we have to talk about Hermann von Helmholtz. The ultimate 19th century genius.
Absolutely. He achieved something thought impossible at the time, measuring the speed of electrical transmission in the nerve.
And before Helmholtz, everyone just assumed it was instantaneous.
Like light, yeah. His measurement showed it was actually quite slow, which contradicted that assumption and opened the door for accurate reaction time studies.
But maybe his most profound contribution was the theory of perception as unconscious inference. He argued that perception is not passive. When light hits your eye, your brain doesn't just receive information.
It actively makes a rapid, learned, and rational best guess, an unconscious inference about what's out there based on your previous experience. It's a constructive process.
Your mind is constantly finding the most likely interpretation of ambiguous sensory input.
And it does it so quickly that it feels instantaneous.
And finally, bringing this rigor to higher mental function, we have Hermann Ebbinghaus. He was dedicated to applying these experimental methods to memory, something everyone thought was too subjective to measure.
Right, and to eliminate that confounding variable of meaningfulness, Ebbinghaus famously used nonsense syllables.
CVCs, consonant-vowel-consonant combinations.
Yep. This allowed him to focus strictly on the mechanisms of encoding and retrieval, without being distracted by existing knowledge or emotion.
And his most valuable finding wasn't just the forgetting curve, the fact that we rapidly lose newly crammed information, which, we all know, but the concept of savings during relearning.
Savings. This means that even when you feel you've forgotten everything about a subject, the memory trace is still there. When you revisit the material, the time or effort required to relearn it is drastically reduced.
That's incredible. That was the first true empirical demonstration of the effectiveness of distributed practice. So if you're studying for an exam, revisiting that material over time, even if you feel like you've forgotten it, is making you stronger than you realize.
Ebbinghaus showed us you could rigorously measure internal states, but that rigor ultimately led to a field that said, forget the internal states, we only care about what we can see.
And that was the moment behaviorism took over in the early 20th century.
Exactly. Behaviorism emerged as a radical philosophical and methodological reaction to those earlier introspective methods and to depth psychology. The goal was pure objectivity, focusing solely on observable, measurable behavior.
So you have John B. Watson's methodological behaviorism in 1924. This was the really strict version.
Very strict. He rejected introspection completely, argued there was no meaningful distinction between human and non-human behavior, and stated the goal was purely to predict and control behavior. The mind was irrelevant.
Just a black box.
But the more enduring philosophy came with B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism in 1945. Skinner's position was subtler, but still totally focused on environmental causes.
And crucially, he accepted covert behavior, things like cognition and emotions, as behavior.
Right, meaning they could still be investigated scientifically even if they weren't publicly observable.
Wait, if cognition and emotion are still considered behavior, what distinguishes them from what the early psychologists were studying?
For Skinner, they're still responses caused by historical environmental contingencies. They're not internal, non-physical mental structures.
I see.
His greatest conceptual innovation was the operant response, or free operant, famously the rat pressing a lever. This wasn't just a simple reflex. It was a class of behaviors. The rat could use its paw, its nose, its tail, that were structurally different.
But functionally equivalent, because they all led to the same consequence.
Precisely. And this framework gave us the two foundational pillars of learning theory. First, respondent or classical conditioning.
Right. This is the realm of Pavlov and Watson, learning via elicited reflexes.
Correct. You pair a neutral stimulus, like a bell ring, with an unconditioned stimulus, like food, until the neutral stimulus alone elicits the conditioned response, like salivation. The behavior is drawn out by the stimulus.
And then there's operant conditioning, which focuses on behaviors being freely emitted.
Exactly. In operant conditioning, the frequency of that emitted behavior is controlled entirely by its historical consequences. So we have reinforcement, which increases the probability of a behavior recurring.
And punishment, which decreases it. It's all learning through consequence, the central theme of Skinner's work.
Behaviorism dominated the mid-20th century, but it faced a huge theoretical challenge, what we now call the cognitive revolution, which eventually led to it being largely eclipsed as the primary explanatory theory.
The most famous theoretical blow came from the linguist Noam Chomsky.
It did. His 1959 review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, was devastating because it argued that language complexity, specifically our ability to generate an infinite variety of unique sentences, could not possibly be generated solely through reinforcement and conditioning.
It just felt too powerful, too generative to be explained only by outside forces.
Right. Chomsky argued that language required internal mental structures, the very things behaviorism rejected, which could process and create novel statements.
And even within the behaviorist camp, critiques started to emerge.
They did. Researchers like J.E.R. Stadin argued that Skinner really downplayed the importance of behavioral variation, which is the random activity you need to generate new behaviors in the first place.
And the reliance on simple association came under fire, too.
It did. Early behaviorism relied heavily on mere contiguity, just things happening near each other, as sufficient for learning. But the later Rescorla-Wagner model showed that competition is also essential.
So learning isn't just forming an association.
No, it's about predicting which stimulus or action is most relevant for an outcome, which requires a kind of internal computational selection process.
So behaviorism was theoretically limited, but it never disappeared. It just evolved into these highly successful applied fields. The purest descendant is applied behavior analysis, ABA, which is essentially behavioral engineering.
Right. ABA is used for a wide range of mental disorders, particularly autism and substance abuse, and it made a significant shift in the mid-1980s.
How so?
It moved away from simple behavior modification toward using functional behavior assessments, or FBAs, so they stopped just treating the symptoms and started investigating the cause or the function of the behavior within the client's environment.
And the major synthesis of all these ideas is, of course, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
CBT is the successful blend. It integrates traditional behavioral techniques, things like systematic desensitization and exposure therapies, with the cognitive focus on internal structures.
So it allows the client to work on cognitive restructuring and emotional regulation alongside changes in visible action.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the behaviorist line of inquiry continues to evolve even post-Skinner. We see the development of relational frame theory, or RFT, which is considered a post-Skinnerian account of language and cognition.
RFT is complex.
It is, but fundamentally it's about how humans learn to relate things abstractly, like relating the word dog to a picture of a dog. And this empirical model of language then forms the basis for modern acceptance-focused treatments like acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
So the influence of that 20th century focus on observable action is alive and well and central to modern treatment.
Very much so.
Before we jump into the clinical revolution, we really need to pause and talk about the critical role played by Black pioneers in mental health. They were the ones who forced the field to confront the institutional biases and cultural assumptions baked into those early scientific models.
This is absolutely vital context. Early psychology often assumed its findings were objective and universal, but it often failed miserably to account for social context, race, and poverty.
So where did we first see this critical challenge arise?
One of the earliest challenges came from Hermann George Kennedy. He was the first psychologist to formally study how the rapport and race of the test proctor could influence the performance and scores in IQ testing.
So he showed the very dynamic of the testing situation introduced bias.
He did. Then the most famous challenge, of course, came from the Clarks. Mamie Phipps Clark, the first African-American woman to earn a PhD from Columbia in psychology.
And Kenneth Bancroft Clark, who later became the first Black APA president.
Their iconic doll study demonstrated something profound. By showing Black children dolls of different colors and asking them to identify which one was good or bad, they found clear psychological evidence that school segregation was deeply harmful, leading to internalized feelings of inferiority.
And that research didn't just sit in an academic journal. It was used as crucial evidence in the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. That is real-world impact.
Absolutely. Then you have Robert Lee Williams II, who tackled IQ directly. He created the Black Intelligence Test of cultural homogeneity.
A test specifically oriented toward Black experiences and speech patterns.
And his results demonstrated that previous IQ score differences were likely not due to inherent intelligence, but rather to experiential and linguistic differences, skewing results in favor of white culture.
He essentially proved that the tests were measuring how well you knew white culture, not how smart you were.
Precisely. And Joseph L. White, often called the father of Black psychology, advocated for a necessary shift toward a strengths-based evaluation of Black culture.
He argued that applying the standards of culturally irrelevant white psychology models invariably led to diagnoses and assessments that just created the illusion of Black inferiority.
And the research of Hope Landrin further showed that societal inequities and stereotypes of groups like women, the poor, and minorities were likely filtering into and affecting psychiatric diagnoses themselves. These researchers forced the clinical field to confront the fact that culture, context, and environment shape not just behavior, but how we assess and classify pathology.
And that brings us to the final major revolution, the clinical framework. When we talk about clinical psychology in the U.S. before 1980, the systems were a mess, to put it mildly.
They were inconsistent. Early classification systems, including the first DSM in 1952, were heavily ideologically based.
Meaning they assumed a specific cause for the disorder.
Right, often rooted in psychodynamic theory. This resulted in diagnoses like a depressive reaction. There was no reliable, unified system, and American psychiatry was suffering a crisis of legitimacy.
What's fascinating here is that the scientists fought back. The true watershed moment was the publication of the DSM-3 in 1980. This was driven by the St. Louis Renard School of Psychiatrists, people like Robbins and Goose, who decided they had to ditch the subjective psychoanalytic assumptions.
Their focus was solely on developing reliable and valid operationalized criteria based on empirical data. And their most radical and crucial move was making the DSM-3 criteria atheoretical and etiologically agnostic.
Atheoretical and etiologically agnostic, that's a mouthful. What does that mean for the average practitioner?
It means the DSM-3 focused only on observable symptoms, not on the presumed cause. If you exhibit X, Y, and Z symptoms for 6 months, you have the diagnosis. It doesn't matter if you believe the cause is trauma or bad parenting or a chemical imbalance. This shift from focusing on why you have it to what it looks like was the major paradigm shift. It made diagnosis reliable and measurable.
And this emphasis on criteria legitimized the field as a medical specialty, which paved the way for the immense growth of the manual. DSM-I had 106 diagnoses across 130 pages. Today, DSM-5 has 298 diagnoses filling nearly 1,000 pages.
The manual continued to evolve rapidly. The DSM-2 first allowed for comorbidity multiple diagnoses at once.
DSM-3 introduced the multi-axial system, which provided context, though it was later removed in DSM-5.
And critically, the shift away from etiological assumptions allowed homosexuality to be removed entirely as a diagnosis between the DSM-2 and the DSM-3 revision in 1987.
Today, the manual faces new controversies, particularly the debate over replacing those fixed categorical diagnoses with continuous dimensional systems.
Meaning everyone falls somewhere on a spectrum rather than just being categorized as in or out of a diagnosis.
And that ties into the future push to incorporate neurobiological science, concepts championed by the National Institute of Mental Health's RDOC project. They want to move away from symptoms toward biology.
It's incredible to trace this arc from the 19th century polymaths trying to measure sensation with physics to the 20th century behaviorists who insisted on pure observation.
To the contemporary clinicians and researchers who are still wrestling with the complexities of culture and the precise definition of illness.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, despite decades of efforts and all the advances in neuroimaging and genetics, diagnosis today still relies primarily on taking a patient history and assessing those accepted criteria.
So the advanced biological markers we need to replace our current symptom-based system.
They simply aren't adequate for classification yet.
Given that the history of psychology shows we constantly shift between observing external behavior and utilizing observable criteria on one hand, and hypothesizing about internal mechanisms, be they cognition or etiology, on the other, this raises an important question for you, the listener. Will the eventual incorporation of neurobiology into diagnosis lead to true understanding of the mind, or will it simply create a new set of physical criteria, forever limiting and defining the complexity of the human experience?